Hello, another podcast episode. And this is a loose follow-up to an episode I did about a year and a half ago when I talked about fairy tales. And yeah, at the time, all that stuff was going on. All the drama was happening with the live action Snow White, and it hasn't stopped. It really hasn't stopped. But here's the thing is in the comment sections, people are voicing how upset they are, and even the pop culture channels are pretty much checking out. They're like, when is it going to end? Can we move on from this? And it's like, well, can Disney Corporation let it go for as much as they rammed that song down our throat? Apparently not. But but here's the one thing that I'm seeing from both the pop culture channels and in the comment section that it's like, hold on. Because they're saying that it's upsetting that this German fairy tale? Where did you get that? German fairy, how much do you know about the Brothers Grimm? How much? What? Okay. Um, Now, before you get mad, because I already see it. I already see where people are going, yeah, go torch and pitchfork on me. Look, with Hans Christian Andersen, we know that he wrote those stories. We know, okay? We 100% know that he wrote The Little Mermaid. We know that he wrote Thumbelina. We know that he wrote The Ugly Duckling. And with some of those stories, we know why he did. Okay? But when it comes to the Brothers Grimm, they didn't write those stories. They collected them. They collected. They didn't uh, look, I'm okay. I have stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of books, and I have quite a collection of fairy tales and folklore from all over. I have the 101 Arabian Nights, I have Grimm's fairy tales, I have Irish fairy tales, I have Hans Christian Andersen, I have poetry from Robert Louis Stevenson, the children's fairy tales. I have Rudyard Kipling and all over. Okay, I enjoy fairy tales and folklore from all over the world, from ancient to whenever. But if you're seriously going to say to my face that Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm wrote Snow White, you, you are fucked in the head. You are serious. It's not a German fairy tale. It's not. Look, okay. So, little history lesson here, people. When it comes to the brothers, they were in college at the time and they became interested in folklore, especially the German folklore, fine. Okay. And before you start flaring up and saying, well, see, there you go, you're wrong right there. Bunhead, what is wrong with you? Are you on drugs? No. Okay. During this time, there was a romantic movement, and this brought back a revival of the traditional fairy tales and folklore. Because if you remember in the video that I did about fairy tales during the Renaissance era and in the early 1700s, it was fashionable to read fairy tales and folklore at costume balls and parties. Dressing up as these characters was was the thing to do. Um, this was the big trend, and a lot like the emo era had taken over, fairy tales had basically taken over at that time. And then it just kind of disappeared, like they do, like these things do. Well, because of this romantic movement, which for those of you that don't know, it was an artistic and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. The purpose of the movement was to advocate for the importance of subjectivity, imagination, and appreciation of nature in society and culture in response to the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And so, of course, with imagination comes these fairy tales and folk stories. Now, where does that leave Jacob and Wilhelm? Well, because there was a revival of folk stories and fairy tales, they jumped on that. Smart kids, okay? But they were collecting. They weren't writing, they were collecting. They were collecting the stories, not writing them, collecting them, okay? Which is not a bad thing. This is the reason we know, one of the reasons why we know about the Brothers Grimm. Okay, because of this movement that was going on, and they jumped on this, like I said, smart kids, because of this, they used it to their advantage. They collected these stories. They also published these books several times. Like it says here, between 1812 and 1857, their first collection was revised and republished many times, growing from 86 stories to more than 200. So they were constantly collecting. The other thing is that they established a method for collecting and recording folk stories that became the basis of folklore studies, which is still in use today. Okay, very busy little bees, very smart little bees. Okay, so now I do want to point out before you get the wrong idea, they did actually write. They wrote Germanic and Scandinavian mythologies. They did have a German dictionary, but that was never finished for some reason or another. But as for the fairies' tales, they collected. He did not write. Those were not their own works. Okay. And two people that they came across. In fact, one, they, I have to give them credit here. Big, big credit here because of the fact that with this romantic movement and because fairy tales and folklore, folk stories had become of interest again, while Jacob and Wilhelm were searching for stories for their book, for Grimm's fairy tales, they actually found this particular gentleman, a fairy tale collector from 200 years earlier who had just become completely forgotten. His book had become completely forgotten, and they revived him, so to speak. And I know I talked about him in the video that I did before, so we're going to talk about him again. Now I'm only going to say his last name because I know I will butcher his first name, and I feel bad when I do that. So Basil, again, last name, they don't know when he was born, but he died in 1632. And his book, The Tale of Tales or Entertainment for Little Ones, as it says here, although the work fell into obscurity, the Brothers Grimm, in their third edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, praised it highly as the first national collection of fairy tales. And now, before I say what Wilhelm said about it, when you look, there is a version of Sleeping Beauty. There is right here a version of Snow White and Puss in Boots, Rapunzel, Cinderella. And so, I mean, this was 200 years before the Brothers Grimm, and you have Snow White here. So there is no way that it's that Snow White is German. Now, I give credit to Jacob and Wilhelm for a lot of other things. I really do. For folklore studies and for reviving this gentleman's work and for reviving him in general so that he wasn't, and for praising him and everything else, and for their other works with the mythologies. Don't get me wrong on that, but Snow White is not, no, when you have an Italian gentleman who has the version here, which it's not even Italian, he just collected it. And so Wilhelm says here the collection was for a long time the best and richest that had been found by any nation. Not only were the traditions at that time more complete in themselves, but the author had a special talent for collecting them. And besides that, an intimate knowledge of the dialect. And he just keeps going with praising Basil for uh, putting together this work and his care in putting together the work and putting and piecing together these stories. How many did it say that was together altogether? I think it was 50, something like that. Anyway, um, but yeah, Wilhelm himself uh praised Basil for this. So knowing full well that there was a Snow White in here. So he knew. He knew that in an Italian book put out by Basil, there was a version of Snow White. And it was in the third, what did it say? Their third edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales. They praised Basil's book as the first national collection of fairy tales. Okay. So so that's Basil. Okay. And again, I do want to point out, let's see, Rapunzel, Puss in Boots, Snow White, um, and Sleeping Beauty are in here. And this was in the early 1600s because he died in 1632. Um, Now, another gentleman that the brothers praised highly was Charles Perrault. Now, in the video that I did before, I believe I kept saying Perrault, and I do apologize for that. It's Perrault. And he was a French author. He he actually was considered the one who founded the genre fairy tale, even though Basil came first. But he was given the credit. So, you know, especially since Basil just kind of disappeared, and his work pretty much disappeared. But Charles worked a little bit harder. He put out a book in 1697, uh, which had Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Puss in Boots, Sleeping Beauty, and Bluebeard. So Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, those were in Basil's. Now, here you have a French book, and it has, yeah. So, and this was at the highlight of when it was fashionable for these stories to be out and everything. Yeah, the trendy stuff and all that. So that would be more of a reason why Charles would be at the forefront of it and everything. And so another reason to look at it, much like why the Brothers Grimm. Of course, with the Brothers Grimm, there's more to it because of their folklore studies and that. So, but the thing about it is that when Rapunzel was in Basil's book and Sleeping Beauty was in both those uh, books, Snow White was in, I don't know that it was in Charles's. I didn't see it in there, but he's best known for certain ones. Anyway, yeah, they just collected these. Now, Hansel and Gretel is known to go as far back as that famous Greek story of being in the labyrinth and leaving with the string. And there are so many different versions from so many different countries. And I think I talked about that in the other video. But I will mention that while a lot of us know the story where the kids go to a house made of candy and the witch is in there, there are other countries who have that it's a either an ogre or a troll and the house is made of cheese. So yeah, you got to take that into consideration as well. Um, but the other thing is that there is an ancient Greek version of um, Snow White. I happened to come across it, and I I'll put it in the description box. And when you actually look at, because I'm not going to read it here. I mean, it's short, but my reading skills are awful here. But just from reading what Wilhelm said about Basil, yeah, I know that my reading skills are not very good here. That's why I don't do audiobooks. But when you actually read the story, there's so many elements to it. I mean, it doesn't have the black hair, the red lips, and the uh white as snow, but the actual story element is there. There's no way you can't say that this is not Snow White. That would be like saying that the because I've read the Cinderella, that's the Asian version from ancient Asia, where it has the magic fish. But it's obviously Cinderella. And if you're trying to tell me that that's not Cinderella, I'm not going to believe you. It's the same thing here. The elements are there. I'm sorry. If you're trying really hard to make something a thing because you have believed it for so long, you got to stop doing that. Oh, I love that magic fish story. It's a good story. So anyway, in closing here, understand that I'm not trying to take away from the Brothers Grimm, but they were collecting the stories. They even made that clear themselves. They did not write the stories. They did write, they did write, and it was the mythologies. And but they collected. They made it very clear that they were collecting these stories. Okay, but you also have to understand, and I think this gets lost in the shuffle a lot of times, is that a lot of countries and cultures have their own versions of these stories, of these fairy tales and of the folklore and everything else. The best way to explain it would be like, excuse me, as my voice goes, would be to think of it as like when in ancient times, travelers set up camp at the end of the night and they're sitting around the campfire and they hear that one story. Next morning, they go their separate ways. And at the new camp, they're telling that exact same story, but have embellished using their own personal touch, using something from their own culture and that kind of thing. That's how it happens. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all. I think the main thing that we should be happy with is that we have these stories that people like the brothers Grimm and Charles and Basil and others have documented these stories, and that we are now finding how far back these stories go, such as the ancient world. And we are finding out more and more just how old these stories are. Who knows? Maybe Puss in Boots, maybe there's a version of it that is actually a dragon. We need more dragons. I will never grow up. I'm telling you right now, I have stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of books in my room. And I have a lot of these fairy tale books. I really do. And I mean, I love 101 Arabian Nights, the one with Scheherazade and Sinbad and the Sailor is like my favorite. I absolutely love Sinbad and the Sailor. And I mean, there's a lot of these that are like the traditional Irish stories and even like some of the Greek stories, like in Basil's story, in Basil's book, he has Cupid and Psyche, which could be considered a fairy tale in itself. So, but you know, at the end of the day, no, Snow White is not German. It's not a German fairy tale. They just collected these stories. And for them for Wilhelm to acknowledge Basil's work and to clearly see that Snow White was there, and that says a lot. And for a lot of Basil's stories to be in Charles's, so you have the Italian version and you have the French version. Yeah, and I will have that information in the description box for you so you can read the Greek version. And you can tell me what you think, but I'm telling you right now, there's so many elements to this that it's obviously Snow White. It just doesn't have the pale skin, the white skin and the that's white as snow and the red lips and the black hair element to it. Just the rest of the story is there. So, but anyway, I will close up here.